essential fatty oils. It's actually really good for you.
Yeah.
Oils and avocado. You can actually smear it on your face. It would be good for you too.
Are you serious?
It's
Like your
deodorant,
skin's
too.
secret down.
That's how I stay looking not a day over 40 when I'm really 41 and a half.
You're not 41 and a half.
I'm pretty sure I am.
You'll be 41 and a half next month.
I'm sorry, I was rounding up. My mensiversary is coming up soon. Mensiversary. It always drives me crazy when people are like, "Oh, we've been dating for 3 months. It's our 3rd anniversary." It's like, no, it's your 3rd mensiversary.
That's
Right? People don't like it because it sounds like menstruation, but
I was thinking you got into Mensa for really
That's-
smart.
but that's why it's called menstruation cycle, is because it happens monthly. So.
does it? Tell me more.
To be fair, I've had like 6-week cycles, you know. Or
To be
just-
fair, we're broadcasting like really. Though you are probably sitting out of the view of the camera.
Yep, luckily no one knows who said that.
Actually, so there's a couple things this week. First of all, it is the 2nd week of Advent.
Mhm.
And so I want to talk a little bit more about Advent, Messiah, and stuff. It's also at sundown today begins Hanukkah.
Whoop, whoop.
So I want to talk a little bit about that. But before we do, unfortunately, I'm getting really sad that every week we have to kind of open the floor for people to share any thoughts or anything about tragedy that happened in our nation. But this week, again, with what took place in San Bernardino, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly. I just wanted to open the floor if anyone had any thoughts or questions or anything they wanted to share or talk about with that, and how you feel about our brothers just to the north that have told their entire campus to arm themselves at Liberty University. You know, the president of Liberty University, Jerry Falwell Jr., said that everyone on the campus should get their concealed weapons permit and start carrying to protect themselves from the Muslims.
He said Muslims?
Yes, and then someone confronted him and he changed it to terroristic Muslims. What?
Never mind.
I'm of the opinion that not everyone should carry guns because not everyone's going to be smart enough to know how to use them correctly. But I mean, they can if they're allowed to constitutionally and stuff. But I think saying everyone should go around carrying guns doesn't actually do much because statistically speaking, well, if everyone had a gun, then maybe, but statistically speaking, people who carry guns and would be able to act in those situations aren't likely to be around in all the places where stuff could happen.
Yeah, and it's still just not a provable fact that that gun violence has been reduced by people that carry weapons. You know, someone made the comment. So just so you guys know my bias, which you probably already know my bias, I'm nonviolent, so the notion of carrying weapons feels absurd to me. I'm not saying it is absurd; it feels absurd to me. But someone made the case that in like the shootings at San Bernardino, in this crowded room where there's a party going on, if everyone draws and starts firing guns in that setting, more people probably would have died because you're cross-firing. Like you're in a room full of people moving around and scattering. You're not a marksman. That the chance for even greater tragedy and innocent people killing innocent people would have increased. So I think that that's at least an interesting question. Like, how would you know, in that setting, it's not safe to fire. So.
Wasn't there recently a situation where, like, a quote-unquote good guy with a gun tried to come to somebody's rescue and ended up actually shooting the victim, like the person that was being attacked or whatever?
Yeah, a person's truck was being carjacked and a citizen shot at the carjacker and instead hit the person whose car was being carjacked, and then the person picked up their shell casings and fled the scene. I don't even know if they ever caught the person. And there you go, from being an innocent person to killing someone, and that is tragic in and of itself. Yeah, it killed the person who was being carjacked. Any other thoughts or questions?
Can people get licenses to carry tasers? Like, why would they just do just that?
Yeah, I think that there's probably a multiplicity of alternative solutions, but like so many other things, we've made this very binary. And even myself, who's not violent, I want to make it binary and be like no weapons, and it's not a healthy or fair.
Yeah, it just seems like there are non-lethal weapons. Why?
Well,
Why is that?
tasers are not non-lethal. Tasers are not non-lethal.
That's
They're closer than
better than a gun.
bullet that she has. But
Yeah, I mean, even like, beanbag, where you shoot like rubber bullets, which they use in crowd suppression and stuff. Like, I mean, I could even
can still break ribs and stuff. But
certainly, but yeah, and so how do you guys think? Because this is such a volatile thing, and even within this room, I would imagine that we have a plethora of opinions and views about that, which I would say we should celebrate, right? Because that's what makes for a healthy community, is that you can have a different stance on something and still love deeply one another. But I mean, what do you think? Because okay, sorry, I'm starting lots of thoughts. The other week when we talked about refugees and talked about having civil discourse, I might be foolish and idealistic, because I actually believe that if we can discover ways to have civil discourse, begin to sit with a posture of not assuming that we're right, but that there might be a more right way to engage an idea. And we give others the benefit of the doubt of being good people and human. That if we talked about these things and shared our views, that I think that a lot of the problems that we perceive or that are outcomes of other things would actually begin to be solved. I think that hospitality actually solves a ton of things, and I think civil discourse is a certain thing of hospitality, right? Because how would you guys define hospitality? And I'm not asking you to define hospitality in light of gun violence. I'm asking you, how would you, if you're just being hospitable, like you're inviting people into your house, how do you demonstrate hospitality? What makes something hospitable?
Care and attentiveness.
Water
Water?
or another drink of their choice.
Okay.
Respect for boundaries,
Yours or theirs?
both.
I think some trust. You opening your house or whatever to people. You probably know them if you invited them, but you might not always.
Sure. Which I would say then goes into the giving them the benefit of the doubt. So what else? Anything else you think of? I would say that in some ways hospitality also is allowing someone who doesn't necessarily have a right to your space be given the right to be in your space, and therefore elevating them from a stranger to familial or something closer than a stranger. I would say it's like that transition. We help people transition from being stranger to being something more intimate. So intimacy is involved. So imagine if we took just those handful of principles and we applied it to the way that we have conversations about, well, just anything really. Like I didn't say, hey, you're welcome to come to my house if you don't talk, or if you share my opinions on absolutely everything. In the same way, if I invite you to my house and I know that you have an allergy, I won't serve bread that night, right? Or I will put the cats in the other room and do my best to clean up, right? I don't have cats, but if I did, I would, right? That in some way, by me welcoming you into the space, I actually take into consideration what is unhealthy for you, and to the best of my ability, remove that from affecting you. Like, imagine if we in some ways approach conversations that way. Yeah.
So I agree, I think, with most of what you're saying. However, I do think I need some guidance in one particular area, because I imagine accountability looks different with this kind of approach. So if you are engaging in a conversation, you perceive there is extraordinary unhealth or abuse, how do you navigate that in a way that reflects the principles that we're sharing,
Sure.
while still being stern and keeping that person accountable?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would say, imagine you invited me to your home. And so you're showing me hospitality, you have taken care to make me feel welcome. And in that welcoming, I take your TV and start walking out your front door with it. Is it inhospitable? I would argue it's inhospitable of you to allow me to do that and not confront the behavior that's destructive to the very thing that you're welcoming me into, right? Your home. If I begin to behave in a manner that destroys your home, then it's actually inhospitable of you to allow me to continue to do that, because I'm destroying the very thing that I was being welcomed into. So I think that this goes, Ashley mentioned boundaries. I think that, to say that I'm hospitable, no one should imply that if people are like, oh my gosh, Cassie's the most hospitable person I ever met, that I go, oh sweet, I'm gonna take her TV when I go over there, right? Because that has nothing to do with hospitality. It has to do with criminal behavior, right? And so I think the same thing is true within conversations. To call somebody out in unhealthy language, to say that, hey, so my home or my part of this conversation has some sacred space and some boundaries, and right now the way that you're speaking is not healthy. And I get that if you were the one, if I came onto your page and you started that, right? If we're thinking social media, that's different than if you coming onto my page, walking into my home and start stealing my things. Right? So I find that, at least with like Facebook or social media, if someone else begins the conversation and they go unhealthy places, I might say, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I will, it's their house. If they come into one of my Facebook page and start behaving unhealthy, usually then I will step in and correct it, and not allow it to go on in my space. So I realize that when we're talking about something that's not as tangible as the physicality of a home or even like our space here, right, that it becomes more complicated. That doesn't mean it's not worth thinking about. But I guess at the end of the day, Chris, I would just say we shouldn't confuse hospitality with being walkovers, or we shouldn't confuse hospitality with allowing people to behave in a manner that's violent towards the space that we've welcomed them into. And that's very different. That's not a hospitality issue. That's a different issue. So I think that there's something to, I've already had people in my home that have young children, and the young children don't, the parents and what the young children are allowed to play with and get into is different than what my household is comfortable with. And there's that really uncomfortable moment when you're wrestling with, do I correct the child? Do I ask the parent to not allow their children to do that? Do I just move the stuff? what do I do and how do I behave? Because in this setting, it's going beyond my comfort zone of hospitality, but it's not such an egregious act that I need to remove that from a situation. And that's where it becomes, I think, in a lot of ways really complicated. Like how much do you bend your language or allow room for ignorance or innocence that we don't appreciate? And then what is just egregious disregard for my space and my stuff. And I think, we've talked about it quite a bit here, and whether, directly engaging it or talking about tangentially, the whole part of what I think makes what we're trying to do with Dust Covenant different than what I've experienced in other churches, hopefully we're not the only church doing it, is that we're saying faith conversations are uber complicated and therefore worth wrestling with. And in our culture and society, oftentimes we reduce everything to its simplest form, which is why we love memes and bumper stickers and other things such as that. But those oversimplify, removing complications from the argument or view. And I would argue instead we should be saying even things that seem simplistic tend to be extraordinarily complicated, multi-layered, multifaceted, and it's worth the work and effort to wrestle with that. Therefore, the same thing with whether gun control or anything like that, we should also be willing to engage other views because it's worth the effort instead of oversimplifying it. And when we oversimplify, we tend to just take the role of teacher and not ever assume that there's anything that we can be taught. And I think that's part of the reason we're in the situations we are in a lot of it, because most Americans, I'm overgeneralizing, so therefore I'm guilty of the very thing I'm pushing against. Right? I would say most Americans perceive that gun control or gun issues is put into very binary things. Either get rid of guns and we should be moving towards no guns, or we should be arming everyone. Right? And I think there's the middle ground that says we should be calling for more difficult or more strict gun laws. But I think for the most part, even the people that hold this view in the middle are tending to lean one direction or the other and hoping that the end result is more strict, but get as many people through those strict laws with guns as possible, or more strict and eventually get to the point where no one has guns, right? I think that most people fall within the two ends of the spectrum, or at least perceive that everyone else does. They might really think that they're very moderate and everyone else falls into those spaces. So any thoughts, questions?
It seems to make communication extremely complicated. It's neat though, but already seems kind of complicated. But then to add all these layers of sensitivity, seems like a computer would help scan the person, figure out what the deal is. But I think that's the whole part of a relationship. It seems so to have any conversations these days about those types of things. It's how's that going to actually go through all right?
Well, I think this is where I think it's more complicated initially, but for instance, in this setting, I would hope that all of us are mutually giving the benefit of the doubt to the other. So you possibly don't have to be more concerned as long as you're open to changing your view. Then everyone dialoguing, giving each other the benefit of the doubt that there's someone who's bent towards God, there's someone who desires for humanity to become better and whole and fullness of life, and we live in that space. I think it actually makes the conversation easier because we can expect that when we say something that the other person will ask us for clarification instead of giving us judgment. And that in the same way when someone else says something to us, that our response is not to judge them and dismiss them, but instead to ask them for clarification. I think that actually makes conversations more simple instead of trying to figure out the perfect zing to prove your point. There's a lot more freedom to talk because I think hopefully all of us perceive the best of everyone else in the room And so we want it to be a healthy conversation. So even if you were to misspeak and say something that someone, Twitter would offend me, the fact that I'm sitting here and I know you and I love you, I can ask you to clarify, and then we can have a conversation about it. Is way more healthy. I think we saw that with, the willingness to do conversations on race and theology that Chris led us through. The room to be unsure allows us to have healthier conversations. So I think we are just kind of broadcasting out into the great black hole of social media. It can feel very complicated. But I think that when you actually are developing community relationships, Chris, I think you kind of touched on this before with me, in the fact that conversations are just very different in our space than what you experienced at work. You shared before that that's been kind of complicated. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I don't know if you want to.
No, yeah, I mean, we have like a measure of sensitivity when we engage one another about any given topic. And when I'm not here and I'm in conversation with coworkers or whoever it may be, I very quickly notice that this person is not being as sensitive as one of us might be in a conversation. And that's when I realize, wow, like this is a skill set that isn't cherished as much. Again, I'm speaking generally, but that's been my experience, especially with my job. It can be very difficult.
And I think as we take this skill set out, so as you have more conversations with people, I would like to imagine that the more conversations you have with like the same person over and over, or someone hearing those same conversations, that it would begin to change their language as well and their perception. So
It's interesting. Thinking like this past month, I've been confronted with more issues that I just don't think about. And it's like, I don't even know how to comment on it, but it makes sense because it definitely creates a different environment here.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, I didn't know that was an issue, and that, and that, and that, and that. We've been watching some interesting TV shows that are confusing too. That throws me off. It's like TV shows. Yeah, it's just different political, ranging from like race to the sexual orientation, all of these things. I'm like, whoa, how do you even communicate about that? So it almost seems easier to completely avoid it, but then it seems like life gets a heck of a lot more interesting when you dive in there. And then like taking to work and figure out how people all of a sudden like it a bit more because you can talk and more around that, they feel comfortable and all that. It's just really intense up front.
I really like what you said, that sometimes it feels, and I'm going to misquote you, so feel free to correct my misquote.
You might improve it.
I doubt it, because I really liked what you said. Sometimes it feels better to just avoid it, but it's exactly, it's
Exciting.
more valuable or something when you jump in. I think that's spot on. I think that we've, in some ways, because we've been inhospitable in our language, and we haven't welcomed the stranger, and when I say stranger, I mean different views than ours, right? We haven't welcomed the stranger in and interacted with it, that we've created some of the issues that we're facing because we're not open to hearing other views. I mean, just think about how the internet works, right? It keeps track of the sites you visit, and then it recommends more of those same sites to you, which means that you rarely, if ever, unless you have someone that you on your Facebook feed, right? But then will ultimately block them just so you don't have to deal with their opposing voice. So the only thing that you're constantly being inundated with are things that you agree with or you have a tendency to agree with. And so like we have microaggressions in racism and human sexuality, and we have microaggression. I would say in the same way we have this micro advertising system that just continues to perpetuate your own view over and over and over again. And so you begin to assume that everyone agrees with you and that you're in the right, and that the people that disagree with you are on the fringes and absurd in their views, right? When in reality, they're in the exact same microcosm you are, where everything that they're being fed, every article they're reading, and everybody that they're talking about, and everyone they're seeing on Facebook, all agrees with them, and you're the one that's in the fringe. And when we have that mindset, we can never, that's too hyperbolic. we rarely can sidestep that recognition and actually engage in a conversation. And I think that that's one of the places that we're really dangerous. So, you think about in olden days when you wanted news, you had to read a newspaper. And in a newspaper, you couldn't control, though you may in some ways by buying a certain newspaper. But if you think even back further, where the only newspaper you were accessing was your local newspaper, you're going to get a multiplicity of views, a multiplicity of ideas and concepts. And so you were always introduced to new or different ideas that you could rant about and write an editorial if you wanted, but you were always engaged. Whereas today, if I were to log on to Facebook, 99.9% of the views on Facebook are going to agree with my views. Because those are who are my friends, those are the people that I like their statuses the most. And the more you like someone's status, the more often they show up in your feed. You guys do all know that, right?
No.
And that,
Sorry, just being difficult.
all the suggested readings are all from things that you would probably appreciate because they want you to click on it. If it's something that goes counter to your view, you won't click on it. So just something to consider, that when we're having these discussions, don't reduce it to a binary. Give other people the benefit of the doubt. Welcome different views. Welcome a stranger or different views into conversation, and see what happens. Because I always think back to myself. 10 years ago, I was maybe 15 years now, but I was a very different theological person than I am today. And something, in some way, and somehow, convinced me to change my perspectives. And I'm grateful that somebody, somewhere, demonstrated the hospitality enough to hear my views, give me different views, and welcome me to the table. And it wasn't a one-time thing, it was people over and over doing that, and that allowed my views, in my opinion, to become more healthy. So, just something to consider.
Well, to sort of back that up, that story of Megan Phelps from Westboro, where she started engaging with people on Twitter and, mostly fighting with them. But then this really kind rabbi just kept showing her kindness in spite of her anger, and eventually she ended up totally changing her point of view. And that was what was really fascinating to me about that story. I mean, one, that somebody who came from what we would probably argue is one of the most hateful places in the United States, changed, but also that what changed her was so much showing her kindness, even when she was telling them they were going to hell, and
Yeah. And so, that's perfect. I do want to say, and this is, hopefully we never get to the point where we don't realize this, but I'll just say it again anyhow. That doesn't mean that you invite someone who is a known abuser to you into your house.
Right.
You understand that, right? There's a difference between being hospitable and opening your front door to someone who has previously caused you harm and welcoming them in. That's very different. So I just want to make sure that we always say that, we always point to that and recognize that it's one thing to be hospitable, welcoming different views. It's another thing to welcome a known abuser to you into that space. Yeah, Chris?
I wanted to ask you before about that in particular. You just brought it up, so that's fantastic. Do you think that?
It's my two-wheel machine with the self-balancing.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Well, it wasn't funny the first time, but remembering how it wasn't funny might have made it funny.
I think that's what made it funny.
Thank you.
Do you think that this is more directed at you because you just said that you were not violent? I know that about you. But do you think that any kind of violence is incompatible with hospitality?
I think I'd have to get you to define violence.
question. Because I think we have like kind of knee-jerk definitions of violence, which often involve force, but I think violence can transcend physicality and be language, behavior. But I'm talking right now about like physical violence. So like the abuser that you're talking about, in my experience, I'm identifying that really as racism in a way that manifests in different areas of society and government. So I'm wondering, if you're being oppressed, by a government institution, law enforcement, prison, corrections, whatever it may be, how do you remain hospitable, honoring that person or entity while also defending you or like the larger you or like the corporate black and brown
Yeah,
experience?
well, I obviously can't answer that and how to defend the black and brown experience. I think this is where it's the hard work. For instance, so let me change the scenario away from racism, because for me, I don't feel adequate for addressing that. But I can say that I get very angry at Christianity and people's unhealthy theology that's oppressive or abusive or manipulative or harmful or violent. And that makes me very angry. And I know people that hold theologies that threaten the name of Christianity, in my opinion, like the reputation of Christianity, such as, I would argue, from my perspective, Jerry Falwell's statements. Where being hospitable comes in is recognizing that, for instance, you guys sitting here, you guys, if you grew up in the church or you had church experience prior to here, were taught very specific things by someone you trusted about the way things work, way things go, way things should be. Those things may now be very far in your rearview mirror as we wrestle with other ways to think about those things. For me to be angry at you directly, so let's say you, Chris, that you held some theologies before you started coming to Dust that now you would say, I would stay away from, okay? I have to, when I'm engaging you in those settings, where you could be a threat to my way of thinking about faith. And when we're talking about the difference between bodily harm and spiritual harm, some people experience it very similarly. I would say that's true for me. So I haven't had the same spiritual abuse that someone that experiences racism or sexism or whatever may experience. I have to recognize that you trusted somebody that you were told was an authority, and you listened to them and you believed what they were saying was true and good. And I need to recognize that that's not necessarily Chris who came up with this view on their own, but it was someone who bought in. So I would say, like, within our government system today, and forgive me if I misspeak, I think that there are people in our system today, whether they be police officers or something else, who believe completely in the justice that they've been taught is being served. And in believing and trusting the people that have trained them and raised them in policemanship, don't recognize that some of the behavior, some of those things that have been systematized actually are a demonstration of racism. And so for them, it's impossible to see around it right now, because they trusted the people that said, no, this is justice, this is healthy, this is good police work, this is sound behavior. And so it's not that the person themselves are are supporting what they imagine to be a racial system, but rather they don't recognize the system to be racial because they were raised in it, so to speak. Just like many of my friends, or to use Thomas' example, Megan Phelps, who was raised in Westboro Baptist, believed it and didn't realize that anything she was saying was actually harmful. She thought she was doing people a favor, right? You guys probably have all heard, if you know the cure to cancer and you know someone dying of cancer, isn't it more loving of you to tell them what the cure is than to just let them die of cancer? And this is, people use that reasoning for using fire and brimstone language for salvation stuff for folks. That's really harmful and oppressive language. And so, Chris, I don't know if I did a good job articulating, but I think that's how I would, without carrying the same emotion that you must feel in conversations that carry, the breaths of racism.
Yeah.
So I don't want to assume that I can mimic that feeling. But if I was trying to think of a way to be hospitable, I think that's probably the way I would wrestle with going, is recognize that at the core, this person might just have bought into a system because they trusted someone. And I can maybe give them the benefit of the doubt from that place. But that's the best I can answer, and that might even be unhealthy, and I would accept a pushback or rebuke on that way of thinking. But off the cuff, trying to engage that, I think that's how I feel at the moment. I could very quickly change my opinion on that. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, I mean, some of your language represents some of like the core philosophy of nonviolence,
right.
Dr. King, and that kind of movement where like the liberation from oppression is both for Black and white people.
Right.
Very concerned with the oppressor, also recognizing that. But see, I teeter between, and we've talked about this before, like the nonviolent Dr. King-esque approach, and then like the Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Malcolm X, Black Muslim, like self-defense armed. And so I'm wondering, I guess you can't answer this, I don't think anybody ultimately can, but more focus on bodily harm. How do you remain hospitable? And so
I think actually if I were to address physical bodily harm, I would say it's the same thing as the analogy I used with stealing the TV.
Right.
That no longer are we talking about hospitality, we're talking about criminal behavior.
Right.
And so in the same way that I wouldn't let someone walk out with my TV, CJ usually comes over every Sabbath and does the lighting of it. If CJ started to decide that carrying pieces of furniture or family members out of my house was appropriate, June. Yeah, June.
But you're saying that, well, this is where it gets more complicated though. So are you saying that then you would still remain committed to a non-violent?
Well, it depends again what your definition of
So
violence
someone's
is.
thinking,
To prevent her from taking or criminalizing CJ right now. Probably because it's the least likely thing that could imagine happening. But I think to say that's not yours to take, to say that this is not what we invited you here for, if in the fact that CJ were to continue carrying my precious books out of my house, I might then say that I'm forced to call in somebody else to handle this. I think the difference, I would say, for me, I'm talking nonviolence versus pacifism. There's a difference between those two things. Pacifism says that in no circumstances is there, you become kind of like a doormat.
right,
And I don't hold that same view. I believe that there is things that we can do to stand up against the oppressor that is nonviolent, but does not just allow the oppressor to run rampant. But again, those are really hard to think about, and so it's just easy to turn into a binary of either I'm a pacifist and therefore people can just take advantage all they want, or I'm a aggressor and or I'm violent. I don't know what the proper word is over here.
yeah, I just said that I'm an inconsistent pacifist, but that might change. I'm an inconsistent, non-violent person.
Yeah. I mean, I think about Bonhoeffer, who was a
Right.
pacifist and determined, like, this is one of the things I really respect deeply about Bonhoeffer was Bonhoeffer actually imagined that participating in the assassination attempt on Hitler, which I don't know if you guys know that or not, but the theologian Bonhoeffer was a part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. He believed that he would probably face eternal damnation for it. That was his theology as a pacifist, that to murder someone would pretty much lock it up for him, that he would spend eternity in hell. Yet, he still went through with the attempt because he believed it was better to save the lives of millions than it was to save his own. Which to me is just amazing. Like that to me is, there's one thing to have martyrdom, which he ended up being a martyr, and there's another thing, willing to sacrifice what you perceive to be your eternal destination in order to do something you believe deeply.
Self-preservation.
Yeah, there you go. So I think the same thing, I think you could call him an inconsistent pacifist then too. Is that there are moments when you're so confronted with a complicated situation that you do what you think is best in that setting as opposed to what may be in a calm and pristine setting you would typically do. And I think that that's okay.
Yeah.
I don't think that you're going to get scolded for that. Is that helpful?
Yeah, and I'll end here, but you also said, it's like people are born into a kind of system, and if they, I guess, so to speak, been indoctrinated their entire lives into a certain way of thinking and behaving, they are as much of a victim of that oppressive structure.
I didn't say as much as,
Okay.
but I would say they are a victim.
Yeah.
But I would be I never like to equivocate the oppressor with the same problem as the victim. I want to be very careful about that.
That's an important nuance, but going off of that, some of us who went to see Tim Wise, he said, and this reminds me a lot of what you're saying, soft on people, hard on systems.
Agreed.
And that really just stuck with me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So just so you guys know, I don't think that this conversation is outside the realm of Advent. I think that this conversation is deeply embedded within the concept of Advent, where you have the merciful, loving, compassionate God who shows ultimate hospitality by allowing us to run rampant all over his creation, right? Over God's creation. And in showing that ultimate hospitality, and then in addition to showing that hospitality and letting us be within God's space on earth, then to even be willing to take some of the blame or some of the responsibility on our behalf, right? As Christians, most of us hold that at some level, in some mystical way, Jesus takes on some of our misbehaviors, misdeeds, misgivings. And so that's quite the remarkable demonstration of hospitality. And I think we can look to Messiah's life as a way to think about how do we navigate in an inhospitable world? How do we navigate in a space that doesn't welcome peace and justice and compassion and mercy, but instead celebrates condemnation, judgment, finger wagging, and destruction? And all we have to do is just spend a few minutes anywhere, social media, news outlets, and we can see that that's what we favor, right? And that's what sells newspapers. We can say, oh, well, they only post that stuff because it's what sells newspapers, but we're the ones buying the papers and clicking on the links, right? And so we are participating in that system. And so what is the way that Jesus ultimately, what is the hope that we have as we're waiting for in this time of Advent for the Messiah to be born? We're anticipating a life that shows us how to live nonviolently in a hostile world that wants to close off hospitality, and instead we see the ultimate forms of hospitality in the life of Jesus. So for me, Advent is very much this conversation. Advent is very much about how do I engage and respond in a world that would rather see me crucified than bring peace, right? That ultimately, I think, is the picture we see in Jesus. Any thoughts about that? Any disagreements?
I really do appreciate the idea of, Christmas, the feast of the Nativity, falling well within the time frame of the season of preparation in its Advent. There's also another element of Advent that not all, but some Christian denominations, groups, whatever, will overlook, and that's the second coming aspect of Messiah, to finally rid the world of sin and death, and to once again set things right, to tear down these systems of oppression. So I'm not saying that the preparation for the birth of Christ is wrong. I'm not saying that at all.
Yeah.
But I think it's also really interesting to kind of marinate, if you will, on that other aspect as well.
Yeah, we talked, were you here last week? We talked briefly about this because I personally pushed back on that view slightly.
Sure.
And because I would argue, the text says that I've not given you any commandments that are outside your realm. Everything I've given you, you can do. And then it also says that if you do all I've commanded you, there will be no poor, oppressed chaos in your midst, right? The Hebrew word carries all of that connotation. It just uses one Hebrew word, but it carries that. And I would argue that when we read in the prophets about who Messiah is, Messiah ushers in peace immediately, not at some future date. But when Messiah is declared, that's when the Messianic era begins, and that's when peace begins to break into the world. So Jesus says in the Gospels, you will do greater things than these. It says in the text that you are the light in the world. And so for me, I think our role is to actually us bring an end to sin, us bring an end to corruption, us bring an end to oppression. That as followers of Messiah, that we've been given that power, we've been given that example of how to conquer this darkness, because we are the light and darkness can't comprehend us either. Right?
I want to apologize if I didn't make it clear beforehand that, if I seem to be putting out like all this apocalyptic,
No.
I wanted to apologize for that.
No need to apologize. I think where I grew up in a church where it was, everyone was kind of sitting on their hands waiting for the return of Messiah. And I know that's not what you're saying. But in hoping that Messiah would return to fix all of the problems, the unintended consequence is we didn't start fixing any problems ourselves, right? If you know that you're going to the doctor in the next day, you might not go through all the steps that you would necessarily go through to start feeling better if you weren't going to a doctor at all. And so this is something that I think we need to wrestle with as the faithful. What does it look like for us to prepare the world for Messiah's return, not just sit back and bide our time waiting for the Messiah's return? Again, I know you weren't saying we all should just sit back and wait, but that's where it becomes complicated. And I think that I'm convinced, though my opinion could change, that with the example that Jesus has given us through his life, and even through what he was willing to do with the cross, that we could indeed bring about peace on this earth by living it out. And I think it feels daunting because we've been raised in such an individualistic religion that it's your personal faith, your personal savior, your personal salvation, your personal whatever. And so we think how can I as one person change the whole world and bring about peace? And so we throw in the towel.
But there's
Whereas-
also that communal relationship.
Well, and I would actually argue it's almost exclusively the communal relationship with just a dash of the individual, right? When God confronts Israel and sends them into exile, it's not 100% failure on Israel's fault or Israel's part. When God welcomes Israel back from exile, it's not 100% repentance from Israel. In the New Testament, it says, you, plural, are the temple, singular, and the Spirit of God dwells amongst you, plural, right? And so that means that when we live communally and we behave in a manner that reflects the commands of God communally, that we build this temple on earth, which fits really well, seeing that there is always only one temple of God. Other gods and goddesses had multiple temples, right? But Jesus, or Yahweh, only has a singular temple.
And we're not talking about bricks and mortar, like literal.
Well, we would be the bricks and mortar if Jesus is the capstone,
Yeah.
right? So in some way, you and I are the blocks that are perfectly hewn, perfectly designed for what it is that we're doing. That if you ever read anything about the temple being built, I mean, it's phenomenal. Like the way it was built is just mind-boggling because the nearest quarry is not near, right? And these rocks would be hewn at the quarry, transported. There's no mortar, there's nothing. They just fit perfectly together because there was so much care taken for the way it was shaped. And to think about that in some metaphorical way for what God's intention is or God's imagination is for his faithful, that we have all been perfectly hewn. We all are perfectly capable for doing what God has called us to do. And we are made better by being next to people, surrounded by people. And that it's not just for us to do on our own. I think that's the hope of Messiah. I think that's the hope of the return, is that we, the faithful, have built this new temple, this new space that even though the physical temple has been destroyed, the temple of God still stands strong. It's powerful imagery, especially if you look at you have the garden, which is the house of God, basically. It's where God dwells and walks. Then you have the tabernacle, right, where God travels and walks with his people as they wander. And then you have the temple that is built for Israel when Israel becomes settled down. And then you have, when Israel is sent to exile, God's own home is, I would say, metaphorically and physically destroyed. And God goes into exile with God's people. Israel returns from exile and God's temple is rebuilt. And then Rome, once again, destroying the temple. The irony being that the new temple was built of many Romans. Right? The new temple contains many Romans within its midst. So I think all very powerful imagery, and the corporateness of our faith is often missed. We spend most of our time thinking about our faith personally instead
Jesus
of
and
corporate.
me, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. So. Anything else? We got just a few minutes before. Anybody know the story of Hanukkah?
A little bit.
You know it?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell it?
All right.
Okay.
So there's this temple in Israel, and there's like two main competing stories that I know of. One of the stories is that there's a civil war in Israel over between like the traditional Jewish way of whatever, and a different one. I don't remember the names of them. And at some point, this king, I think Antioch was part of his name, steps in and takes the temple by force and converts it to Roman style of worship with sacrifice and everything. And then eventually the traditional Hebrew people take the temple back and restore it to the traditional Jewish faith. And then there's like a legend about them finding only 1 day's worth of oil in the closet or whatever to light the torches that represent the temple, and using it for 8 days. But basically Hanukkah is like a celebration of the restoration of the temple to traditional Jewish worship from Romans. And the other main story is that instead of a civil war, it was just like a complete aggression on the king's part.
Yeah.
Like it wasn't like stepping into a civil war. It was like he just wanted to take Israel.
Awesome. That's spot on. Good job. Thanks. So may I add a couple
Yeah.
imagery elements? Like
Yeah.
your story is accurate. Let me add some imagery. And some of you may have heard me share this before. But for me, so you have Antiochus, who comes in, as CJ said, and to kind of show dominance, slaughters pigs and smears the blood of pigs, which would be an affront to Israel, all over the Holy of Holies, sets up idols in the Holy of Holies. And so imagery and statues of different Roman gods or Caesar, I don't know who or what exactly, but sets up idols. And basically makes a mockery of the temple.
And everything that the law stands for.
Everything that, well, more so just, if you think about the temple in the terms of God's home, I think this is a much more beautiful way to look at it, right? So they went into God's home and vandalized it in the most offensive way. So imagine, think about like cross burnings in front of people's homes or swastikas in other people's homes, that type of desecration, the most offensive things you could do in a person's homes. That's what Antiochus cooked up, so to speak, in the Holy of Holies and the home of God. And so you have the Maccabees, who, the story of the Maccabees, depending on what story you read, they're like all you guys have seen the movie 300, or at least familiar with it. I mean, it's that whole concept, small group of people, not very good odds at all, ends up winning, right? So that might be the difference between 300, they ultimately lose. But they end up beating Antiochus and throwing Antiochus out. I love that you said in the closet, because that just totally made me think of like getting in like the, like our hall closet. That was awesome. But in the temple, they found only 1 day's worth of oil, as CJ said. The oil was used to light the menorah. So the menorah was a candelabra that was sacred and used only in the Holy of Holies. So the menorah you see today for Hanukkah is different than the menorah that's described in the Torah. The menorah in the Torah, I believe, only has 7 arms. This one has 9, 8 candles, 8 candelabra candle holders to represent one for each day, plus then a master candle, some call it a Messiah candle, and that candle is lit every single day and used to light one additional candle each day up until all 8 are lit, and plus the Messiah or master candle. So Israel, when they went in, found only 1 day's worth of oil for the menorah. So that left them with something really complicated to decide. Do we light the menorah today, knowing it will run out in 24 hours? Or do we wait until we have more made, and so that way the lights never go out again? Because the menorah was always to stay lit. Right? The light was never to be extinguished. And in the imagination of Israel, I liken it to the front porch light being on. Right? So think about like Halloween, the front light was on. What does the front light being on signify if you're a trick or treater?
Candy.
Yeah, someone's home, right? that someone's home. And so in Israel's imagination, the menorah represented the presence of God, that God was home. So it was as if God's front porch light was on, right? And so Israel wrestled with, do we light it for one day knowing that it will go out tomorrow? Or do we wait and light it after we have more made? Some of the rabbis imagined that God had the same dilemma. And God wrestled with, is it more important for Israel to light it now and risk that it doesn't stay lit, or to light it later? And some rabbis imagine, and this is the one I love, that God couldn't wait to be home. And so God honored the lighting of the menorah on that first day and never let the light go out, because he wanted Israel to know that he was in their presence. To me, that is beautiful. That is the picture of Hanukkah, is that God is home. God is in our midst. God is present, which isn't necessarily the traditional celebration of Hanukkah, but I think really appeals to me because it comes around the same time as Christmas. And God with us is language that we often use, Emmanuel, at this time of year. And to me, those go hand in hand in such a beautiful way. Exactly.
That explanation lends a lot of very wonderful things that I see in the liturgy that's in the tradition that I'm in currently. Is there's a candle that is to always stay lit.
Mm-hmm.
We call it the light of the presence, or the sanctuary light.
Yep.
And it's placed right above the tabernacle, where the consecrated hosts are held on reserve.
Right.
And it's this that now I see some imagery beyond, okay, it's there because, Christ is truly present in the tabernacle and in the Eucharist and everything, but it goes beyond just that. The church as we know it today.
Yeah.
It holds root in that.
And I would just be
Makes it that more special.
certainly. Let me just say this as just a note. Be careful though. I love that picture of Hanukkah. But Hanukkah is not the Jewish version of Christmas. It's also not, as Marjorie was sharing with us on Monday, it's not even, except for in the United States, a big deal anywhere else in the world within Judaism. The US it is, because we get so hot and heavy about Christmas that in some ways Hanukkah has also been elevated. It's not a high holy day. It is mentioned in the Bible. In the book of John, it says Jesus went up to the festival of lights, which is Hanukkah. So we know that even by the time of Jesus, it was being celebrated. But I just want to be careful. It's not the Jewish version of Christmas. It has nothing to do with that piece. And nor should it, if you decide that that's something you want to express at some point, Hanukkah and the celebration of God being back in the neighborhood, so to speak, that you should use it as a replacement for Christmas. Because that's not the intention behind it. We can conflate those two, and we shouldn't do that. So if you know someone who is Jewish and celebrating Hanukkah, you should never reference it to their version of Christmas. Even though the way I just presented it can feel very Christmassy. That is a vein of teaching within rabbinic thought, but primarily it's about the regaining of the temple for Israel again in insurmountable odds and the miracle of 8 days of the oil. So I just want to say, because it's never healthy to co-opt someone else's traditions. So just to keep that in mind. You are welcome to celebrate, as my family will tonight, celebrate by lighting candles, and we'll do so for the next 8 nights. And if you talk to Tana, she could tell you if there's any nights that our family would be welcome to host people. I don't know what our schedule is, but you would be welcome to at least come out. Friday night, we will definitely be doing it when we light the Sabbath candles. We will also be lighting the candles for Hanukkah, because Hanukkah goes 8 days. So let's be doing that. So, all right. If you want to stop the broadcast, sorry we ran late.